if you think about some of the language of the civil rights movement, we shall overcome is hopeful. But after that comes someday. Well, I think what we're seeing now is that we have not yet arrived at that day.
Elizabeth Alexander is here to talk about the Trayvon generation, her meditation on race, justice, and their intersections with art.
I'm certainly not saying that Keats himself was a predator, but he isn't just the innocent young man in love with Fanny Brawn.
Lucasta Miller joins us to help us see a great poet more clearly and to talk about her new book, Keats, A Brief Life in 9 Poems and 1 Epitaph. Plus, our critics will be here to talk about books they've recently reviewed. This is the Book Review Podcast. It's April 15th. I'm John Williams. Elizabeth Alexander joins us now. She is a Pulitzer Prize finalist poet, the author of the memoir, The Light of the World, and I'm willing to bet that you remember her reading her poem, Praise Song for the Day, which she wrote for Barack Obama's inauguration in 2009. Her new book is The Trayvon Generation. In the book review, Mitchell S. Jackson calls it a profound and lyrical meditation on race, class, justice, and their intersections with art. Elizabeth, thanks so much for being here to talk about it.
I'm glad to be here.
In June 2020, you published an essay in The New Yorker with the same title, The Trayvon Generation. Tell me a bit about that essay and how it led to this book.
Well, in June 2020, we had been locked down for the pandemic, which I think is important because people were in a kind of isolation and also in their homes when we saw George Floyd's murder by police over and over and over and over again, repeated from the cell phone film that Darnella Frazier, 17-year-old girl, recorded. And from that, as we know, there were protests around the world, across the country, that were calling attention to the unresolved American issue of racial injustice and violence. I mentioned Darnella Frazier because she is a part of a generation of young Black and brown people who I call the Trayvon generation. These are young people who have been raised on a steady exposure to this violence against Black people, recorded, seen over and over and over again. And I think we need to think about what that has meant, how that has shaped this generation, how it has taught them about their own vulnerability, how it has taught them that the Black and brown bodies that they move in the world in can put them in danger, but how also we look to them and want for them joy, freedom, brilliance, self-expression, politics, raising their voices, all the things that we need our young people to both experience and to also offer the society. So that was where we were in June 2020. And I wanted to say something about it. And I wanted to offer the art and culture and, history and perspective that I have always thought in my long career as an educator were something that could help light the way. In that essay, too, I was listening very carefully to the cultural production of people of a younger generation who I thought were capturing very powerfully this sense of vulnerability, the anxiety, the depression, and the creative light that has come from that generation. So by that, I mean Kendrick Lamar. I mean looking at videos by the musician Flying Lotus, thinking about television shows by brilliant younger Black creators like Insecure and Atlanta that were dealing with questions of depression in this generation. And all of that came together in the essay. And then after that, from there came the book.
And you mentioned anxiety and depression, and you said that watching these things over and over have taught them about their vulnerability, but in addition to teaching them, it's traumatized them. And you see this in your 2 sons as well, who now are in their early mid-20s.
Well, yes. I mean, what I see, and I would, start with my sons, but move to their friends and move to the generations of young people who I have taught. Young people around the age of 19, 20 are my specialization and the people I have loved through teaching, loved through culture, loved through the empowerment of critical thinking for over 3 decades. And yes, I did see in those young people a heightened sense of anxiety and also of navigating what it meant to be walking around as the questing, dear young people they are, but knowing that the eyes that were cast on them saw them as, to echo Du Bois, who I echo in my book, W.E.B. Du Bois, a continual problem. He asks around 1900, how does it feel to be a problem? And talks about the problem of the 20th century being the color line. And I think we can ask that same question now, thinking about Trayvon Martin, thinking about Tamir Rice, thinking about, this litany of names of these beautiful young people going to the store to buy Skittles and hunted. How are you supposed to process that when you are also a young Black person in a hoodie at dusk?
The word generation is right there in the title, and a lot of this is about a generation's very particular experience, I think mostly driven by technology and having phones in their hands at all times. Take me back to, because obviously, as you so eloquently say in the book, it's a very deep-rooted American problem. It's been with us forever. So take us back to your childhood or your early years and how the vulnerability of the Black community was expressed to you and differences you see in how you were raised to see that and feel it. And now, if you were, say, 12 years old these days.
I've been thinking very deeply about that question because a few people have asked me, if this is the Trayvon generation, how would you name your generation? And so I think back further to what we might call the Emmett Till generation. So when Emmett Till in 1955 was sent by his mom from their home in Chicago to Money, Mississippi to visit family over the summer, was alleged to have whistled at a white woman, was taken from his family home, was beaten, was shot, was put in the river. And his mother did the extraordinary thing of bringing his body back to Chicago, putting it in an open casket, saying, I want the world to see what they did to my child. And the casket and Emmett Till's body were photographed and published in Jet magazine. So that was the technology of the time. Jet magazine moved things through Black communities incredibly effectively. And some people say, if, for example, you go to the National Museum of African American History and Culture, and where they have Emmett Till's casket in a very extraordinary display, you will hear his mother talking about Emmett Till as the sacrificial lamb that catalyzed the civil rights movement. Of course, there was movement activity going on, but that might be one way to think about that generation and the way that image affected people. Many, many have written about it, talked about it. You speak to Black people who were teenagers at that time, and it was meaningful to all of them. I think that when I was growing up in the 60s and 70s, I do think that even though violence and dehumanization against Black people go all the way back to when we were brought here as property and classified 3/5 human beings. I mean, I would say that dehumanization precedes violence. I think it has to. So that's a long American history. But I did not feel that we were in a generation. I thought we were in a generation where it felt that progress was being made.
Mm.
I think that coming out of, if you think about some of the language of the civil rights movement, we shall overcome is hopeful. And if you stop there and take that literally, I would say that's what my childhood was about. But after that comes someday. Well, I think what we're seeing now is that we have not yet arrived at that day.
Yeah, and as someone who is in such a unique position to have seen the, I guess what some call progress, and then you see as maybe a reaction to that progress, going from the inauguration in 2009 when you read your poem to more recent years where it does seem like, whether it is partly a media saturation issue, but it does seem like there is an increase in violence against Black people and a particular kind, and that we're going back maybe to a time before some of the progress had been made. Is that what it feels like to you?
Sometimes it sure does. I mean, and I think also when you think about, and I write about this in the book, when I talk about my father, 88 years old, a child of Harlem, as is my mother, as am I, and that my father's first remembered encounter with the police came when he was 8 years old. That would have been in 1941. And his mother said to him, get out of the encounter safely, but memorize the badge number. Come home with that badge number so that then we can take action to make this better, but get out of the situation safely, which is totally, I think, an echo to the way we teach our young people today. What do you do if you're pulled over by the police? What do you do if you're stopped by the police? And this idea that we pay their salaries from our tax dollars and that they are here to serve and protect, and many do, but that we're also seeing, and we're seeing it recorded. We're seeing it recorded. Some really, really blood curdling exchanges that I think are more relevant because these are people who our tax dollars pay to serve and protect. So I don't want to focus this only on the police. I mean, I talk in the book, as you know, about larger systems of white supremacy and therefore by implication Black inferiority that are taught by, for example, Stone Mountain, the world's largest bas-relief sculpture, the world's largest Confederate monument, and what it means when something like that is normalized. When people picnic at Stone Mountain, it's in Atlanta, Georgia, and think of it as a spectacle and someplace to go and have fun and someplace to go on school trips without being focused on the fact that it enshrines white supremacy.
Along those same lines, in terms of an image that is meant to fade more into the everyday background, you describe in the book a painting at Yale where you were both a student and also eventually taught. Talk about that painting and what you realized about it.
The title of that chapter comes from the wonderful poet Adrienne Sue. I borrowed a phrase from her. She is Chinese American and grew up visiting Stone Mountain, living in Georgia as a child. And she talks about the shock of delayed comprehension. You know, what happens when you realize the place where you've been recreating is teaching something very, very terrible. And so I use that to talk about two periods in my life at Yale University, one when I was an undergraduate, another when I was a professor. And in what was called the corporation room of the university, there was a painting of the namesake of the school, Elihu Yale. And we would have our important meetings there and do our business. And I was there countless times before noticing that there was a brown person, diminutive, in the painting to the side at the foot of Elihu Yale with a metal collar around his neck. And so at that moment when you see, oh my God, we've been looking at this subjugated person, this subjugated brown person, this person with a metal collar around his neck all this time, as though it's normal, as though that makes this an appropriate space to do our work. I conflated that with a memory that only came back when I wrote this book. And that is when I was an undergraduate, there was yet another painting of Elihu Yale in the Berkeley College dining hall, in which on his other side was a Black boy with a padlocked metal collar around his neck. These people were in the paintings to signify the wealth and status of Elihu Yale. And these paintings were up without comment. And so when you look back and think, wow, I blocked that out. I couldn't take that in at the time. You know, mind you, I'm someone who notices.
I was about to say, you're someone who teaches African American history. So
yes, I'm the one who says, there's the Black figure. I look at paintings, I teach them, I write about them. They've taken both paintings down, and the portrait of the boy was exhibited at the Yale Center for British Art with a wonderful wall label, as well as really great contextualizing historical material that you can get to. The wall label says, when you look at this painting, center the boy. What happens when you look at this painting and you don't center the person of wealth and power, you know, the white man who's the so-called important person, but rather, what do you see and learn when you look at the boy? What questions arise? What history do you want to understand more richly? So I think that there's been a really terrific reframing. And further, the New Haven artist Titus Kaffar has made an amazing painting that's been displayed there called Enough About You. And that is a painting where the boy, in fact, is in the center.
Well, the book is a lament for some of those centerings that happened in the past. It's also a celebration, very explicitly, of Black culture and art and expression. And it's beautifully illustrated, if I can say. And I wonder how it was to curate those images. And you write at one point in the book, I wonder, do I really believe that cultural expression can somehow shape a world where our children are safer? And I don't really mean to pose that to you as a question, because in the book it's kind of left open ended, because I think it's a question that haunts you more than you can actually answer. But talk a little bit about the art in the book, why you chose it, and what you see as its role in maybe guiding a new generation.
I'm very proud and really quite thrilled that I was able to make a book with beautifully reproduced, mostly African American artists in the book in conversation as part of the book. I wanted those works by Elizabeth Catlett, Glenn Ligon, Lorna Simpson, Carrie James Marshall, Jordan Castile, I mean, on and on and on. I wanted them to be a part of the text itself. I wanted the reading experience of this book to be one where you could read the words all the way through if you wanted to. You could read the images all the way through on their own if you wanted to. And ultimately, I think to read words and then pause with images, to think about how they are in conversation, to think about what words sometimes can't get to, and to have the art be part of the offering that I also want to make this generation, which is what leads to that question. Can art and culture alone, is that enough in a world where our children are not safe? When I wrote that sentence, that was an absolute crux moment in writing this book, because I realized I was 3/4 of the way through doing what I've done my whole life, which is to say, art and culture, critical thinking, history. I believe, I believe, I believe. And I do, but I do not believe it is enough to keep our children safe. And I thought it important to pause at that moment. And that's what made finishing the book very, very hard. I don't always write in order, but with this book, I had to get to the ending and think about, could I answer that question? And I think I leave it to readers to understand that there is still so much work to do.
Away from art, in addition to art.
And never without art. So, I mean,
Sure. Yeah.
I also think, I think we wither and die without art. So
Yeah, I don't think you can read a page of this book without without realizing that that is definitely a deep message in it. I'd like to end with a larger question that I don't want to say to divorce it from politics, obviously, or from these problems, but I think maybe on a slightly more personal level, because you did mention you have spent your whole life as a thinker about these things and a practitioner as a writer. And so I'm wondering if you have any general ideas in what you believe in terms of the relationship between pain and art.
well, I've thought about that a lot during the COVID pandemic, and seeing in my work at the Mellon Foundation, our organization is the nation's largest funder of arts and culture, and seeing this wide and varied sector that makes the things that I care about so much and that we all live by, looking at the economic devastation when lockdown came, just looking at, artists of all kinds who live by gigs, watching that just get shut down, and they're not having a way to earn a living, and yet persisting in making their art. I do think that art is a life force that actually can't be squashed. I really, really do believe that. And one of the things that I thought was that with so much suffering with the racial, I don't call it the racial reckoning, but the racial upheaval of the last few years, so much suffering with the assault on democracy and our fundamental rights, culminating visibly in the horrific spectacle of January 6th, and so much suffering with the losses from the pandemic, the deaths themselves, and the deaths, of course, disproportionately people of color, disproportionately poor people, and the isolation and the pain of isolation, saying goodbye to people without the ability to do so in community. So I think that we would agree that the last few years in the United States have been a time of tremendous pain. And I believe that art is the way we understand what we are living through.
And on an individual level, and I know that I said that would be last, but I want to bore down one more level, because when I think of you either writing a poem or a memoir, how does your own creative impulse help you, or does it, handle pain or see it in a different light?
I wrote a memoir, The Light of the World, about 8 years ago after the very unexpected death of my beloved husband. And I think that's an example of turning grief into art. But the writing of it was, again, not so much to go through or vanquish or process the pain, but rather to know what I was living through. Art for me is a way that I look inside of myself almost wordlessly, even though it comes out in words, and say, what is being experienced here? And I think that as a human being, I have something human to share. And that's what artists have in common. And that is what is the very unique power of art. It literally carries humanity. It literally carries souls, I believe, from one soul to another. And if it's done well, it allows us to imagine ourselves in other people's experiences. It allows us to, even if it's not about grief, it could be about joy, it could be about, and in my memoir, which was occasioned by grief, it was about love. It was about love. It was about living through art. It was about family. It was about the complexities of the United States and first generation families. It was about many, many, many things. So if it did its job, it was a piece of my soul saying to others, please come in and please tell me who you are. And that's been my experience with that book in the years that have followed.
Well, the power of art is present in this book, not just in your words, but again, in these beautiful illustrations that you've chosen to accompany them, and a very, very wide group of artists and some incredible work throughout to let people sit with those concepts. The book, again, is The Trayvon Generation. Elizabeth Alexandra, thank you so much again for taking the time to talk about it.
Thank you for this conversation. I really appreciate it.
The biographer and literary critic Lucasta Miller joins me now. Her new book is Keats, A Brief Life in 9 Poems and 1 Epitaph. Lucasta, thanks for being here.
Well, thank you very much for having me.
So this book complicates our notion of Keats, the world-renowned poet. Summarize for us the vision of Keats that your book is meant to complicate. In other words, before we read the book, what do you think is the sort of popular vision of Keats?
I think the popular vision is of him as this rather sort of ethereal creature, a sort of delicate flower, the embodiment, a sort of loveliness, a sort of spiritualized essence. This really goes back to the myth of Keats that Shelley created in his poem Adonais, written after Keats's death. And what I really wanted to do was to get back something of the real flesh and blood Keats as a real complicated human being. I'm not trying to undermine him in any way. I'm just trying to make him more complex. And I love him all the same. I love him even more as a result.
Let's start with him as a very young person. You write that in his early school years, he was more pugilistic than intellectual. So here we already have him non-ethereal, scrapping with people. What was that mood like for him, and when did that erupt?
He had quite a difficult childhood in some ways, particularly the fact that his father died suddenly in an accident when he was 8, at which point his mother ran off and he and his siblings never really lived with her again as a family. He was at boarding school. I think he had, therefore, quite a lot to worry about underneath. He was famous for fisticuffs at school, and one of his schoolmates later said, I always knew that boy Keats was really special. He was charismatic. He was going to make his mark, but I thought it was going to be in the military. And what I'd say about that is that at a slightly later age, Keats was this aggro little chap, and then suddenly all his energy started pouring into his schoolwork and into his reading, and then especially into his reading and also writing of poetry. So I wanted to, have this idea of him not as a sort of dreamy poet, just sort of waiting there for the inspiration to descend, but as this incredibly determined, ambitious, hard-working individual The Romantics have so many myths about creativity, and it's very easy for us simply to reproduce their myths. But you can just see from Keats's life that the importance of poetry as craft is really there. You can see him working at it, getting better and better.
He was from a very young age into wordplay, and he put a lot of energy into that. And so I guess that always existed alongside of his other traits. And so when he took his energy and he devoted it to poetry, the result was the result.
He had an almost innate love of language. One of the earliest anecdotes we have about him as a very young child, maybe sort of 4 or 5, was that when people said something to him, he'd always reply by saying something that rhymed with the last thing he'd heard, and then he'd laugh. And so he had this innate delight in language. Of course, he didn't instantly become a poet. He became a medical student first. But when he decided to give up medicine for poetry, I think we have to see it partly in its historical context. You have to think about the enormous cultural capital that poetry had during this Regency Romantic period. This is the era where Byron has turned the poet into a superstar.
You write that biographers, some of them have almost over empathized with him, and that might go some way to explaining why we think of him as this frail and very vulnerable person sometimes. What about him inspires that? Was it the rough childhood, or why do you think biographers sometimes have that stance toward him?
Well, I mean, it's an utterly devastating story. This young man full of life who dies at the young age of 25. I mean, it's going to make you feel protective towards him. And, I do too, but that doesn't mean that I can't look, for example, at his quite confused and complex attitudes to women, say. The other thing that I think I really emphasize is Keats's physical body and his interest in physicality. The sensuality of his poetry is really rooted in his feeling for the human body, which of course came from his early years studying medicine.
You mentioned his complicated feelings toward women. You write in the book that he wasn't always, quote, idealistically romantic, which again is another part of maybe the caricature of him that has been passed down. What were some of those complications? Are we talking about normal complications? Could he be unkind to women? What was the tone of that?
Well, he did say to one of his friends once that he feared he didn't have a right feeling towards women. And some of his poetry is quite problematic, certainly in the era of Me Too, particularly his poem, The Eve of St. Agnes, in which set in medieval times and the hero creeps into the castle and he hides and spies on the heroine as she undresses and gets into bed, and then she falls asleep. And then he gets into bed with her, and then we have this incredible moment of erotic consummation that's obviously expressed through metaphor. But of course, she's not awake at the time, so she can't really give her consent. And in fact, when she wakes up, she cries, alas, alas, and woe is mine. I think we could overdo this. I'm certainly not saying that Keats himself was a predator, but he isn't just the innocent young man in love with Fanny Brawne. He'd caught syphilis before he met Fanny Brawne, but he's terribly, terribly insecure about the way that women see him. He's very short. He's only 5 foot tall. That's what I was trying to bring out.
Let's talk about Fanny Brawne, because I've seen the movie Bright Star and also read about them, and all of those things have cemented this idea of their relationship. What was that relationship like, and what have we maybe misunderstood about it as it's been written about throughout the years?
Well, the thing I really liked about the film was the way in which it really gave Fanny a full character, because she's been treated rather badly, posterity. But I think Keats's feelings towards her really had an intensity of passion, and indeed included emotional cruelties. Like, he identifies with Hamlet at one point in his passionate letters towards her, saying, "Get thee to a nunnery." He's so violently jealous if she goes to a party when he's ill and can't go out. What I find about that is not so much that he's being cruel to her. I read it as this very, very young man who knows he's going to die. And what he's really jealous of is the fact that she has independent life and can go out to parties and he can't.
I should say I loved the film, so that was not a critique of the film. I would hardly recommend it alongside your book.
The film does follow the actual chronology really very well. In that sense, it's really quite accurate. But aspects of Keats that we don't get in the film are, for example, the political Keats. Keats was politically radical, and that's one of the reasons why his work was so incredibly controversial at the time he published. we see Keats as our sort of ideal of what it is to be poetic. And it's because we know his work so well, it's easy to forget quite how original it was at the time it first came out and how it was considered incomprehensible, vulgar, even gross. I mean, particularly the sensuality of the imagery. So when he uses a phrase like slippery blisses to describe a woman's lips, I mean, there's saliva in there, there's body fluid. I mean, this is a man who is constantly aware of physicality, and people just found that yuck at the time. Similarly, when he uses a phrase like the naked brain, this is a man who had actually seen a naked brain in the anatomy room.
You do say that the word you used, gross, was a direct quote from one critic at the time. I'm curious about the structure of the book and how you alighted upon that. It is structured around 9 poems of his. One of them is at the beginning of each chapter, and then that leads into a piece of your analysis. How did you decide to write the book that way?
I wanted to really put the poetry up front. I think often with literary biography, the life gets explored in every possible detail, but the work sometimes takes a slightly secondary role, and I wanted to put it first.
And you certainly weave in both literary analysis and biographical analysis in a way that they strengthen each other throughout the course of the book. I was struck while reading it about the fact that here we are reassessing someone, trying to clear up as much as we can the historical record and rescue someone from caricature. And yet also, Keats had this incredible, equally renowned to his poetry in some ways, his collection of letters, which is considered one of the great collections of correspondence in literary history. And it made me wonder, do his own letters do anything to clear that up, or did they somehow make him a bit more opaque? What role do they play in? I assume that they would make him more knowable to us.
Oh, they absolutely do. I just urge everybody to read Keats's letters. They are so full of vitality and energy. They switch. One minute he's describing what it feels like to eat a nectarine. The next he's talking about philosophy. The next he's telling us about what's happening in current affairs. And the next we get a masterpiece just sort of suddenly popping out onto the page. The film Bright Star does quote from a couple of the letters, but only the odd line. And I just wanted more because you've got Keats's tone of voice. He talks about the poetical character having no character, but the irony is that in his letters, Keats himself is absolutely there on the page.
And did those letters help you in making any of your argumentation throughout the book about how he really was as opposed to how we see him, since that's him sort of addressing us directly and not just through his work?
Absolutely. All sorts of aspects of his letters, from the very famous passages where he talks about his concept of negative capability, for example, to just the way that he uses language with such joie de vivre. When, for example, he describes having seen the display of Scottish dancing on his visit to Scotland, the way that he describes it, the way he writes it on the page. In fact, I can almost feel like reading it to you, but you can practically see the jerks of the dancers. So this is on 1st of July 1818, he depicts this display of Scottish dancing. They kick it and jump it with mettle extraordinary, and whisk it and fleck it and toad it and goad it and twirled it and wheeled it and stamped it and sweated it, tattooing the floor like mad. And you can just, the way that all those words end in it, he spells, it's like the word kicked, but he spells it Kickit, and jump it, like that. And so, literally the writing is jumping up and down on the page and actually embodying the idea that he's trying to get across. I love Keats's spelling. I mean, it's very idiosyncratic and quite funny. I mean, at one point he talks about how he smoked a cigar, spelt Segar, although I'm not sure that was a very good idea given his chest condition.
I don't think his doctor would have recommended it.
No.
Given that you do foreground the work so beautifully in the book, why don't you read us a part of it?
Yeah, I'd love to read you La Belle Dame sans Merci, which is indeed a masterpiece that just pops up in the middle of a long letter that Keats writes to his brother. It just pours out of him, and it's almost totally perfect finished form. It's a beautiful and mysterious poem, and I think it's probably his most formally perfect poem too. La Belle Dame sans Merci, a ballad. Oh, what can ail thee, knight at arms, alone, and palely loitering? The sedge has withered from the lake, and no birds sing. Oh, what can ail thee, knight at arms, so haggard and so woebegone. The squirrel's granary is full, and the harvest's done. I see a lily on thy brow, with anguish moist and fever dew, and on thy cheeks a fading rose fast withereth too. I met a lady in the meads, full beautiful, a fairy's child. Her hair was long, her foot was light, and her eyes were wild. I made a garland for her head, and bracelets too, and fragrant zone. She looked at me as she did love, and made sweet moan. I set her on my pacing steed, and nothing else saw all day long. For sidelong she would bend, and sing a fairy's song. She found me roots of relish sweet, and honey wild, and manna dew, and sure, in language strange, she said, I love thee true. She took me to her elfin grot, and there she wept, and sighed full sore, and there I shut her wild, wild eyes with kisses full. And there she lulled me to sleep, and there I dreamed. Oh, woe betide, the latest dream I ever dreamed on the cold hillside. I saw pale kings and princes too, pale warriors, death pale were they all. They cried, La belle dame sans merci, thee hath in thrall. I saw their starved lips in the gloam, with horrid warning gaped wide, and I awoke and found me here on the cold hill's side. And this is why I sojourn here alone and palely loitering, though the sedge is withered from the lake, and no birds sing.
Thank you so much. That was lovely. Lucasta Miller's new book, again, is Keats, A Brief Life in 9 Poems and 1 Epitaph. Lucasta, thank you so much for being here to talk about it.
Thank you very much indeed.
I'm joined by 2 of the Times' esteemed book critics now, Jennifer Szalai and Alexandra Jacobs. Hello, you 2.
Hi, John.
Hello.
We're going to talk about some things you've recently reviewed. Alexandra, let's start with you. This week, you reviewed a book by a writer named Jack Lowry. What is that?
Well, the book is called It Was Vulgar and It Was Beautiful with an ampersand. And it's a really fascinating look at an artist collective called Grand Fury that was instrumental in escalating the urgency of the AIDS crisis in the 80s and early 90s. So I'm sure listeners know the phrase silence equals death. This is the group responsible for designing the poster that advertised that slogan and, really embedding it in the public consciousness.
And they literally plastered this poster and others all around Manhattan and other cities?
Many things I learned from this book was this sort of important role of wheat paste. Now with social media, things like this are sort of circulated online instantaneously, and we forget, or though, some of us, including perhaps even the author, just weren't around when that wasn't available. And so it really was a old-fashioned tacking up of posters. And, people's heads weren't in their phones. They're walking down the street, seeing these posters. That's how the message got out. It wasn't a meme. It wasn't a hashtag. It was tacked up on the street. I never thought, wheat paste was really important. And then getting into the book, I just learned a lot about the history of activism and how important this seemingly mundane substance was for getting the word out.
So the posters are sort of the push alerts of their day.
Exactly. I wish I'd said that. Damn. Darn.
Lowry does seem like a young guy. How did he go about writing this book and researching it? And do you know his connection to the subject?
It started as his Columbia master's thesis, but he was lucky in that the Grand Fury Collective, there were 10 core members, I should say, because others joined it, and all but one of them are alive. So, and the one who died had started a memoir. So he was able to draw from that. So he really just had a ton of primary material. And of course, AIDS activism in general has been much documented. But to my knowledge, I don't think anyone has done as extensive interviews and research as he did on the formation of the group. And it was just a really, I thought, a very compelling way to look at a very large, messy movement, lots of players, lots of politicians. By focusing on these core 10 people and their stories, he was able to really take us back to this sort of horrible, horrible time for gay men when, they're just dying in droves, young men dying in droves. And there was just tremendous anger and desperation, but also a lot of camaraderie and collaboration and all those things. So it's a very moving book.
Given all the members who are still alive, does the book ever have a kind of oral history feel to it? Do you get all those voices?
No, I didn't. Inevitably, I was reminded of, the boys in the band, of just like sort of all the work from that period. There's a whole literature which he draws upon. He does it as a kind of through written narrative. It really had a more novelistic feel to me than the feeling of an oral history. Oral history is great. I love oral histories, but in this particular case, there's something about the settings. You think about activism, there's a lot of it that's very boring. It's like, oh, we got to get the phone tree going, and we're ordering in pizza, and we're having an argument in a meeting, and we've got to collect the cash, and a lot of it is kind of dull. But he managed to find these. Keep in mind, all of these activists, if they didn't have HIV themselves, they had partners or friends. They all knew people who were dying. And so he just gets really up close and personal with what they were going through at the time, which I think is incredibly necessary.
Jen, you also took a dive into the past in a personal way, going a little further back in time to the philosopher Wittgenstein and his private journals.
Yes. So I reviewed this new translation, and actually it's the first time that it's been translated into English in a volume. These are Wittgenstein's private journals from 1914 to 1916. And he actually kept these in the same book as his regular notebooks. And so the way it was laid out, this volume, I should say, has been edited and translated by the poetry critic Marjorie Perloff. And the way that this was laid out for Wittgenstein is in his notebook. On the right-hand side, he would write his regular notes in regular script. And those have already been translated into English. And a lot of that material actually got turned into what would, of course, become his Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus, which was published after World War I. But on the left-hand side, he would scribble in coded letters. He would use a childhood code that he used with his siblings, these private notes to himself. And so this volume reproduces those private notes, translates them into English. We have the original German on one side and the English on the other. And, Perloff really wants to show what was going on in his actual life and what he decided to put into this coded script while he was developing the thoughts that would become the Tractatus. And so what you find, and it's interesting because Wittgenstein, he signed up to fight for the Austrian side immediately when World War I started. And he really seemed to see this as a personal test for himself. The larger political questions, he didn't really seem that interested in them. And in fact, because he had lived in England before, in his notebooks, he actually says that he thinks England will win and that it must win. And so he really presents this as a doomed endeavor on his part in some ways. But
a test of his mettle.
A test of his mettle. He has a lot of complaints about his fellow soldiers, which is really, I think, one of the very distinctive things about these notebooks. I mean, I think when we think about wartime diaries, there's often this sense of, despite the horrors that are going on in the larger world, that a lot of the authors of these diaries find some sort of solace or consolation in camaraderie. And that was not the case with Wittgenstein. He has many complaints about his fellow soldiers. And in the meantime, he's really trying to do his work. And this was a work that started out as a philosophical investigation into logic, into the form of logic. He doesn't go into necessarily great detail in a lot of these notes. A lot of them are just, I did some work today, I did no work today, I did some work and felt good about it, I did some work and felt terrible about it, essentially. Eventually, you do see this turn because later on, he was actually sent to the front. For a while, he wasn't actually fighting in the front, and he was actually sent to the front, and he describes the experience of being shelled at and how terrifying it was. And he comes to this moment where he realizes that his work has expanded from the nature of logic to the nature of the world. And so in the space of like a 1,000-word review, you're not necessarily going to say anything new about Wittgenstein and his philosophy. I mean, there have been so many volumes that have been written about that. And actually, it's also interesting because he is still a very contested philosopher, I think, partly because the Tractatus was written in these aphorisms, and then it ends with this mystical turn with a line, whereof one cannot speak, thereof one must be silent. And so it's just really interesting to get the texture of his life, to get the sense of his preoccupations at the time. And I think for anybody who has any interest in him or in his philosophy, I think that this is a really worthwhile volume.
Well, the question that occurs to me is that if he wrote these in this childhood code, did he want them to ever be read?
That was something I wondered myself. He subsequently would also write other things in code. I think that there's some fragment that Perloff does quote at some point where he says that he finds it very comforting to know that he's written certain things in code because he doesn't want them to be legible. So I imagine that this was not necessarily the kind of thing that he thought would ever be published. I mean, a lot of it is also taken up not only with his difficulties with work, not only with how much he disliked his fellow soldiers, but also how often he masturbated. I mean, that is a theme that comes through very clearly in this book because he really associated it with whether or not he was getting enough exercise. I mean, that seemed to be something that he thought was necessary to record in his own script for his own private consumption.
I'm always just tickled by the idea of someone like Wittgenstein having banal thoughts, the average everyday things that people think about.
Right.
And
exactly.
I should just say for listeners, they should read this review, obviously, and they should also go online. I've been joking with you off air about how the last year or so, you have this little subgenre that you've been reviewing of essentially troubled geniuses. There was a biography of John von Neumann and Kurt Gödel, and now Wittgenstein. And you're always great, but there is something about these reviews that I find especially they're kind of like potted biographies. You get so much information into them. So let's name the books you both reviewed again this week.
It Was Vulgar and It Was Beautiful by Jack Lowry.
And I reviewed Private Notebooks 1914 to 1916 by Ludwig Wittgenstein, which was edited and translated by Marjorie Perloff.
Remember, there's more at nytimes.com/books. And you can always write to us at books@nytimes.com. The Book Review Podcast is produced by the great Pedro Rosado from Headstepper Media. Thanks for listening. For the New York Times, I'm John Williams.